It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the mother of all talk shows. Go get 'em, George.
George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
He's back, and this time it's no more Mr. Nice Guy. Donald Trump, before he's even got his feet in the presidential slippers, has halted one war and restored TikTok, which is going to keep on ticking, keep on talking. And the reality is that the Democrats are now cast asunder. They are in pieces with no sign of any leader or narrative which can bring them back together. And Trump has talked to President Xi and President Putin and intends to have a powwow with them about bringing to an end the other war. Speaking of war, the only British politicians to be interviewed by the police under caution over the genocide in Gaza are two politicians, including Jeremy Corbyn, the erstwhile leader of the opposition Labour Party, who are to be interviewed under caution, which is effectively under arrest in a London police station over the next couple of days. Those who sold the weapons that carried out the genocide earned nothing but profits. Those that sought to sabotage those weapons, as is illegal duty in an adjudged genocide, well, they're rotting in jail. It's all coming up over the next 2 hours. It is, after all, the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
The moment I saw Chris Nineham, the luminary who has marshalled anti-war protests in London for 25 whole years, a quarter of a century, when I saw him on the ground, pulled to the ground by London's finest metropolitan police officers, I knew immediately that Britain wasn't as free as it used to be. Because in the beginning of the Stop the War Coalition, I was one of its leaders. I marched at the head of countless demonstrations. Hardly a litter offence was committed when we had millions of people on the streets. No window was broken, no person assaulted. These were the most peaceful mass movement marches that I could ever imagine. And I'm no longer associated with the Stop the War Coalition, but of course I continue to support their efforts to stop the wars. And when I saw Chris Nineham, the man in charge of these demonstrations, smashed to the ground, I felt a very troubled feeling in my stomach. Made even worse, as dozens, scores, maybe more than 100 activists from Saturday's march against genocide in Gaza were reportedly thrown into cells under arrest. And then I learned that Nineham himself had been arrested. He's now been released and has been bailed, and the cockamamie theory is that a group of 70-plus-year-olds smashed their way through police lines to lay flowers where they wanted to lay them, but the police had sought to preclude it. This is all a lie, as video evidence attests. Not only did they smash through no police line, it would be a parlous police line that could be smashed through by septuagenarian pacifists. After all, they were invited through by the police officers, and the video attests to it. I'm not making too much of this issue, except it goes to the issue of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. I feel sure of one thing. It is that the decision to take these extraordinary measures was not made by the Metropolitan Police. In my experience, the police like to avoid conflict, especially with septuagenarian pacifists. They were ordered to take the measures they did by the British government, the worst British government in my memory, and my memory is a long one. A government which has taken away freedoms, given away our money, and is likely, if not stopped, to introduce a kind of tyranny to the United Kingdom. And up with that, we will not put. It might happen in the end. We are not, after all, enough millions to change the government, but we certainly will not go quietly into that good night. Because our grandfathers, our fathers, and even, in the audience tonight, some of us fought, and many died, gave their blood, gave their limbs, gave their psychological health to fight and defeat tyranny. And we will not allow our country to become one like the countries that we defeated in the Second World War. We may visit tyranny on other countries, indeed we very definitely do and have, but we will not allow tyranny in our own country. So if the police are forced by the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, to take these matters further, then there will be trouble in the land. And it's not trouble that we have sought. We, those who fought against genocide, who fought against our country's involvement in the genocide in Gaza, are not the criminals in this picture, and we will not be treated like them. Turning to Donald Trump, he's back. In a matter of hours, he will be again the President of the United States. Speaking personally, I'm not overjoyed that he is again the President of the United States, but I am overjoyed that Kamala Harris isn't. And I feel amply vindicated in that view by the events of the last hours and days. Already the incoming president, not yet in office, not a chicken McNugget has landed on the presidential desk in the Oval Office yet, but the ceasefire that he promised the voters of Michigan he would make sure happened before he took office has now taken effect. And the sight of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of them women and children, exultant in the streets, the sight of the Palestinian resistance who have endured an onslaught of almost unprecedented proportions in a territory so small, are still armed and ready. Don't take my word for that, take Anthony Blinken's word. Blinken, the real president of the United States over the last period, said that the Palestinian resistance were as strong today as they were at the beginning of the onslaught. The only thing that has changed is that Gaza now has more amputated children than any cohort of children ever in the history of humankind. The only change that there has been is that well over 300 Palestinian journalists and photographers have been deliberately murdered by a Western allied country, armed, financed and covered for diplomatically by your government and by mine, almost certainly. The only thing that has changed is that hundreds of thousands of people have been murdered or maimed. Dr. Abu Sitta, the respected British surgeon who served at least 2 stints in Gaza during this emergency, says that 16% of the population of Gaza has been murdered in less than 16 months. That counts as a genocide, you know. Whatever Keir Starmer, the famous international lawyer, says, that is a genocide, which is the attempted annihilation of all or a part of a group of people, not for anything that they have done, but because of who they are. This genocide is, I believe, a Holocaust deliberately engendered and supported by your government and mine. It will never be forgotten. The events of the last 16 months have changed all of us. Surely they have changed all of us. As I've said many times, if the butchery of Auschwitz and Treblinka had been live streamed, it would not have looked all that different to what we have seen live streamed over the last 16 months. All is changed utterly, and a terrible beauty is born. That beauty is the absolute rejection of Israel's claim to be a democracy, the only democracy, of Israel's claim to be people like us, of Israel's claim to be a Western ally which just happened to find itself in the Eastern world. It has died. Israel has died. Not yet physically, not yet organically, although that must be the most likely long-term outcome of the events we have just lived through, but died in the hearts and the minds of the people of the world. And it's now a thing of shame to have been a supporter of that genocide. You can see it written all over their faces. You can see it in their posts on social media. You can see it in that sinking feeling that they have, that they killed all those people, spilled such an ocean of blood, and nothing was achieved. The agreement that has been reached and today is now being implemented could have been reached at any time in the last 16 months. It is identical in character to the resistance proposals that were consistently rejected and blocked, and for which President Biden and President Blinken never once seriously pushed. The ceasefire may not last. Most ceasefires with the settler state government in Tel Aviv don't last. May last only a day or a week or a month. But at least for that day, for that week, for that month, Palestinian women will not have the risk of being cut down with razor-sharp steel, sheets of flying glass, consumed in fire and hell, unleashed by Western airplanes supplied by the United States, targeted by the reconnaissance flights of the United Kingdom, and explained away by Western journalists and by Western heads of state and government. At least for that day, week, month, some food will arrive in Gaza, some medicine. There are no hospitals in which to treat people, So tent hospitals, field hospitals, will now have to rapidly be produced. And I believe that such is the goodwill now around the world and the mass of the population of the world that the effort to relieve the suffering of the people of Gaza will be on an unprecedented scale. The issue then will be what happens next. Well, that will in part be decided by which Donald Trump turns up. If it's the Donald Trump that was on the stump in Michigan, in Dearborn, on the eve of the election, it will be a settlement which brings at least a modicum of justice. If it's the Donald Trump posing beside Miriam Adelson, taking the shekels from the State of Israel's biggest and richest supporters in the United States, it will not. We'll discuss with a man who knows a thing or two about that in just a few minutes. And it's to him and to the events in which he was central that I wish to turn. Sam Husseini is not just an independent journalist. He's one who made it somehow into the belly of the beast. It's him that was there week after week after week, sometimes vainly, but sometimes very successfully, asking questions of the talking heads put up by Joe Biden about the injustices of the Middle East and, in particular, the suffering of the Palestinian people. Sam Husseini had long ago earned the respect, the admiration, and the love of many hundreds of millions of people around the world. He was already a big journalist. Until this week, when in a scene reminiscent of a Munich beer hall circa 1933, with a dissident voice being raised, Sam was dragged by thugs, organized by Miller, the smirking mouthpiece who smirked his way through a genocide. He was not just ordered out of a press conference, he was dragged out in a scene that could well have come from Hitler's Germany. He's joining us tonight to discuss what happened to him. But from what we saw, and what we saw on the streets of London yesterday, about which I have already spoken, I don't know about the slogan, "Make America Great Again." I'm not sure it was ever great. I certainly don't advance the slogan, "Make Britain Great Again," because I'm not sure when it was ever great. But one thing is for sure, both the United States and the United Kingdom are not as free as they used to be, and even in recent times. In modern times, no former leader of the Labour Party has ever been summoned to a police station to be interviewed under caution as a result of a peaceful march against genocide. In modern times, no American journalist has been treated in the way that Sam Husseini and his friend Max Blumenthal, who also very bravely bearded Blinken at that press conference in the last couple of days. Our rights to speak freely, our rights to express ourselves using the technology that is now available to us, our rights to march, our rights to assemble, our rights to assert our rights have never been under greater threat. Such that an app viewed mainly in the past by people who like dancing girls or dancing boys was actually, in this sea of troubles in the world, occupied presidential time to ban it. I refer, of course, to TikTok. No disrespect to TikTok, we're broadcasting live on it right now, and I myself have millions of views on it. But it would not be the thing I would settle down in bed at night and turn to. It was mainly inhabited, though not at all exclusively, by young people who liked young music and young dance moves. But it committed one serious blunder. Not being Chinese, this is a canard. TikTok was not banned because it was Chinese. It had always been Chinese. It was banned in the last year. It was banned by law change and by an absence of a presidential veto, presidential executive order to stop it for one reason only. On TikTok could be found the truth of what was happening to Gaza. Now, they already knew that you and me knew the truth. They already knew that you and me were watching the videos on Twitter, most usually. But they could not accept that the truth would be seen by tens, scores of millions of young people in America, because that was contributing to the most important outcome of the last 16 months, namely the sea change in the United States in the national attitude to Israel. TikTok was banned, not because it was Chinese, but because there you could find the truth about what was happening in Gaza. And therefore, it may historically be seen as the moment of overreach by the Israel lobby in the United States. It's one thing to algorithmically strangle the likes of me. It's one thing to refuse someone the right to enter the United States on a speaking tour. It's another thing to alienate young people in their scores of millions by telling them they could not view an app that they had fallen in love with. And that's why Donald Trump's ace card was played today. Before even coming into office, he told TikTok they should continue publishing and that he would make sure that a negotiation took place which led to the securing of America's interests and kept the app open. There will be much consternation, much grinding of teeth and rending of garments in the Israel lobby this evening. They have suffered a major defeat over TikTok. But they need to suffer many more defeats. And that brings us back to Donald Trump. He has spoken already with President Xi and with President Putin. He plans a powwow with both of them. He started, he says, in the way that he means to go on. The whole world must earnestly hope that that is so. Sam Husseini, up right after the break. Stay tuned.
The 1897 edition of War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Read by George Galloway. Available only on Patreon.
The cylinder was artificial, hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. Good heavens, said Ogilvy. There's a man in it, men in it, half roasted to death, trying to escape. At once, with a quick mental leap, he linked the thing with the Flash on Mars. The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat and went forward to the cylinder to help turn. But luckily, the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
So are you looking forward to 4 more years of Trump? Answer yes or no on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway, on my X, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. It's kind of 50-50, actually. It's quite intriguing. Your vote is going to matter. that is for sure. Get voting. If you want to call the show, it's toll-free in the United States and Canada, +1 844 944 3344. It's free of charge in the United Kingdom and Ireland, 0808 196 5522. And the worldwide number to call is 0044 203 966 2625. Now, Chay Bowes is a master in geopolitics. He hasn't just graduated in it, he has lived it. He's a political commentator of note. He's an Irishman in Moscow, and he is up first on tonight's Mother of All Talk Shows. Chay, always a great pleasure. I must say your output is growing in strength to strength. You're unmissable for events going on in the Russian theatre, and I think that it's to that theatre, especially with a ceasefire in Gaza, we're all now going to turn, because it's quite clear. I was interviewed by a Ukrainian journalist today that they believe that it's the end game, because Donald Trump means it when he says no more Mr. Nice Guy. Zelensky has not been invited to the inauguration. That must be pregnant with a great deal of meaning. It looks to me like we may be in the final months of the war. How does it look to you in Moscow?
Mm-hmm. Well, George, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. And again, thank you for your hard work and persisting despite all the threats to our free speech that you very aptly described. Well, here in Russia, I suppose a little context would be useful. As this war goes on, and the Russian economy and Russian life essentially stays very much the same. I was just having a conversation yesterday, actually, ahead of coming on, with a few younger Russians, asking them about how they perceived the war, how they perceived life here. And if anything, the war here is fading into the background of normality in a way. And in some way that informs how I think the Kremlin will engage with any peace discussions. The context here is the Russian army is advancing. Toretsk, surrounding Pokrovsk, everyday settlements, dozens of kilometers, forward advances. The Ukrainians only now control, a fraction of what they controlled in Kursk. They're losing a huge amount of men and material there as well. So Russia's winning the war in a military sense, absolutely so. Little pinprick attacks from the Ukrainians on an oil depot here there. Russia's a continental landmass. These type of attacks have no impact whatsoever on the outcome. Everybody knows what the outcome is. I think the Ukrainians, the Americans, the only ones don't seem to accept it is your friends up the road in Whitehall there, George. But I think there is a sense now, though, with Trump coming. And this is also very interesting, your poll saying 50-50. What do people think of Trump? Well, my perception of Trump is I don't really care about his politics. I don't care about his past. I really don't care. I care about peace. I care about him and his new team challenging the forever war machine, which you and I have talked about so many times, this pernicious relationship between conflict and politics in the Atlanticist think tank fantasy. We've seen it in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. We've seen these wars that, remember, they said they were going to stand with Afghanistan as long as it took. And it took, a long time, really, decades. It took trillions of dollars, but they left overnight. That's what happened in Afghanistan. So I think there's a real dawning of reality now in Europe as well, which looks like it's going to face bankrolling Zelensky's jaunt alone now. So in Russia, there's a sense of enthusiasm, if you like, optimism around Trump. Everybody here knows what Donald Trump is, what sort of politician he is. But the fact that he's not as bought into the think tank fantasy, as I say, this echo chamber of these sort of closed circles of advisors, people like Jeffrey Sachs, people like you, people like Glenn Deese, and all the professionals who could have helped, John Mearsheimer, these greats, Professor Stephen Cohen, all these great people that could have advised him exactly what was going to happen in Ukraine are all kept outside. And these gratifying people are all brought in. So the reality is dawning now with Trump as a disruptor. And disruption can be a good thing when it comes to conflict and war. I think he wants to look after America, make America great again. To do that, you're going to have to stop hundreds of billions of dollars being flushed into one of the most corrupt dictatorships on earth right now. And that's what Ukraine has become. I've said it for years. It is a dictatorship. It's a singularly governed state. And it has to end. The people in Ukraine know it. They're terrified. They're living in a police state. They're being dragged from the streets. I try to publicise that as much as I can. My colleague that you spoke to earlier as well, there's a terrible reality dawned in Ukraine now that this is only going to go one way. So there's a sense of hope. There's a sense of realism. But there's also something that I would say to everybody listening from Russia here, from living and working among the Russians for years now. The Russians don't do drama. They don't move quickly. The Russians, I think it was Bismarck said, the Russians take a long time to saddle up, but when they do, they ride like hell. So the Russians have begun only really recently in terms of the conflict to really master the supply chains, to master the command, to innovate on the battlefield and change the way they do warfare. And if there's anyone on earth that knows war, it's the Russians, as you know, as a man who studied the Soviet Union, understands it. The great sacrifice of the Russian people and the Soviet people, 27 million people died fighting Nazism, defeating it. This is a living part of our history here. People are already starting to talk about May 9th here in Russia. How will it be celebrated? Will it be a big celebration this year? Will Musk come to the May 9th parade here in Moscow? So there's a sense of measured optimism that something's going to change. And certainly that this black-eyed, shark-eyed delusion about Ukraine, the likes of Blinken and Biden, and this utterly inept cabal that he surrounded himself with. I mean, look at Palestine, look at the Middle East, and the delusion that they were working in the interests of peace at any stage is remarkable. Same here in Ukraine. Everybody knows there's a singular cause of the conflict here from 2014, the last phase of it, where a legitimate government, as imperfect as it was under Viktor Yanukovych, was overturned. It was overturned. Everybody knows that. Victoria Nuland, Jeff Pyatt, they overturned the government here. They appointed the government. She was recorded doing that by the Russian security services. So we know that I think the EU particularly are going to have to be dragged to the peace table. I think people like Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer will have to be dragged to the peace table. And there's only one man on earth that can drag the EU and Starmer to anything, and that's probably Donald Trump. So we live in hope, but the Russians will negotiate as they advance, and they're advancing. They're finessing their military. It's growing. People here are, I would dare say, as tragic as it is, so many people dying in Ukraine, over 1 million people. People have given their lives here as well. It's a war. But dare I say it, the longer it goes on, the more confident people are that the victory is there. It takes time. Russians don't do anything in a hurry. They just don't do it. Their default is skepticism. So they're skeptical, but there's an undercurrent of hope and excitement with somebody who's, essentially, an innovator. Trump is an innovator. He wants to do the deal. And he's laid it out there. He said he's going to fix this. So the Russians are going to sit back and watch, but they're certainly not going to stop advancing. The war will continue. The advances will continue. And one final thing, which I think is very important. Anybody who thinks that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will negotiate about territory like Kursk with Kiev, he's already said, we don't have anybody to negotiate with in Ukraine. There's no government there. The president is illegitimate. The parliament is illegitimate. So he said, look, we're not going to negotiate with these guys, but they're certainly never going to negotiate on the basis of territory. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So we live in hope, but it's a really, really exciting times. We're really looking forward to see how the big Don, as we call him over here, does on the next couple of days.
Well, let's detour into the rest of Europe for a minute before coming back to the battlefield. I have some thoughts I'd like to test your opinion on. But in the interview I did this afternoon with a Ukrainian journalist of note, it's clear that there is a class of person, not her, but there is a class of person who thinks that there can be life for the Zelensky regime after Trump, because people like Keir Starmer and one or two others continue to give wholehearted support. You will have seen the ludicrous, utterly, Alice in Wonderland idea that Britain is going to give £3.6 billion per year for the next 100 years. Now, no parliament can bind its predecessor, no parliament can bind its successor, but that's going the extra mile. 100 years we're going to give you 3.6 billion. Well, first of all, that will not last. It will not last even into the next parliament, never mind 100 years. But Keir Starmer can't support the Zelensky war effort on his own, can he?
Look, this is ludicrous. I mean, and the context in which Starmer has made this declaration. It's as if somebody said, look, give me an idea. Well, let's do a 100-year deal, because none of us would be around to see it fail. It's just ludicrous. Like I say, it's Alice in Wonderland stuff. But the context in which it's done is interesting. The day he came to Kiev, there was a report issued into the NHS where 5,000 nurses were interviewed about the catastrophic conditions in the NHS, people being found dead under coats, on trolleys and on benches, essentially third world levels of services for British people. You know, the cuts to energy. When I met, let's say, or confronted the British ambassador here in Moscow, I asked him, I said, how can you promise, tens of billions of pounds to fund a war in Europe, in a country most of the people who live in your country would never have known existed if you hadn't anointed yourselves as the defenders of this dictatorship? How can you do that while cutting back on things like gas for pensioners? I mean, it's just brutal. And this idea of 100 years of support is just ludicrous. How about a 1-year plan to fix some of the problems that the UK is facing? How about an hour sitting with a pensioner to find out just how hard life is on the high street and in the estates of the UK? It's utterly delusional. So there's no way that Britain can fund this war in Ukraine. There's absolutely no way that Europe can fund the conflict in Ukraine. There's no way they can do it. And that's why Europe is so terrified right now. Ursula von der Leyen, Guy Verhofstadt, all these sort of pro-war libertarians, whatever that means, they are absolutely terrified that Donald Trump is going to say enough. And he's liable to do that. This is the wonderful and terrible thing about Donald Trump, is he's liable to just hold onto the tablecloth, stand up, and just pull the whole thing down onto the floor. And it's a remarkable reality we're facing, and it's this sense of insecurity that is moving people towards the peace table. It's not for a want of peace, because the scam in Ukraine is so fruitful for the elites there. They don't want to end it. The European Union doesn't want to end it, because, God forbid, they'd have to actually face some of the catastrophic effects of the self-harm sanctions that they've implemented, destroying the German economy, the beating heart of European industry destroyed. So, I mean, this is just absolute fantasy. But it's always been a fantasy. There was always going to be a day where they realized that the emperor actually has no claws. There was going to be a day, and I dare I say it, tomorrow is the beginning, the dawn of that day, where the child, that the people like us who were the children saying the emperor has he's no clothes on, dare I say it, the realization is going to land very soon that there's going to have to be peace, not for the want of peace and stability, but because of the fear of a catastrophic failure. The collapse of NATO, the collapse of the European Union itself, potentially, all for Ukraine, all for a country that isn't a member of the EU or a member of NATO. It's remarkable.
Amen to all that. It's not just that we've sacrificed our economies, and that, of course, we clearly have, sacrificed the living standards of the most vulnerable in our societies, that we clearly have. But we're now beginning to murder democracy itself in Europe. The brazen, blatant cheating of the people of Romania, for example, of their presidential choice. Might not have been my choice, Chay, maybe not yours, but he was the Romanian people's choice. And he was cheated for one reason only, namely that he wanted to end the war in Ukraine, not allow Romania to be a base camp for it. And next month, we've got a poll in Germany, general election, where they're really beside themselves with fear as to what the outcome of that might be, and they might end up trying to cancel that one too.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I agree with you. Călin Georgescu may not be our political choice. He may not align with a lot of things that you and I may agree on, although we disagree on some things. I've been very vocal in defending the right of the Romanian people to have their democratic will. It's this a la carte attitude to democracy, which we see now in the European Union. It's just, it's so poisonous. We've seen it as well in Moldova, by the way. All you need is an allegation of Russian interference. You need absolutely no evidence of it. Now, we saw the president, Salome Zurabishvili, in Georgia. I was in Georgia, witnessed these paid protests. I was on the streets watching this occur, talking to students who'd been given 20 euros each for every banner they would bring. I confronted the people holding the Russia, or Georgia is not Russia banner, and they turned out to be Italians, couldn't speak Georgian, had been flown in by an NGO to hold this banner in English in the middle of Georgia. So this idea that the Russians are interfering in the democratic process in Europe is ludicrous. Again, it's projection. It's like this million Russian soldiers who are dead. I mean, that's just absolutely laughed at here in Russia. It's a ludicrous idea, but it's projection. There are a million dead in Ukraine. The idea that it's Russian interference in Georgia, in Moldova, in Romania, and now in Germany is just remarkable. You're allowed to choose any leader you want in the European Union once it's their leader, once it aligns with their Atlanticist view, once it sort of agrees that you have to ignore things like the attack on the biggest piece of energy infrastructure in European history, the Nord Stream, a crime that the perpetrator and the victim neither want solved. It's quite remarkable. So, I mean, we're really beginning to see the veil slip now. And when Donald Trump is sort of advised and counseled by somebody like Musk, who seems to be quite awake when it comes to this type of stuff. He did a big spaces with the head of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. Again, not a party that I'd agree with on everything by any means, but I would defend their right to have their opinion once it's constitutional and democratic. Same with Călin Georgescu in Romania. Same with the Shore Party in Moldova, who were attacked for being pro-Russian. No evidence. And it all stitches into this narrative of the bogeyman of Russia. And today, of course, we had the Washington Post admitting that the cables up in the Baltic weren't damaged by Russian submarines. They weren't attacked by the Russians. It was a trawler that did it. But that headline is at the bottom. The damage is done. The muck is thrown out there. People are so busy in the UK and Ireland, in Germany, trying to survive, find the money to pay for their kids' school lunches, trying to navigate inflation and the cost of living crisis, that everybody's heads are buried in that sort of reality. They don't get the chance to look at a headline twice. So the client media peddles this lunacy, but never rescinds it, says, oh, by the way, we were wrong. So it seems that the EU is again desperate now. So I think the EU wants Ukraine to go away. It wants it to go away. And in the halls of the EU, I know a couple of European MEPs. I know a couple of people who actually used to work advising NATO. And they say in the halls of NATO and in the halls of the EU, everybody agrees that Ukraine will never join either. Never in our lifetimes. It's a bit like the Keir Starmer 100-year promise. I'll get to you next week. I'll get you tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. It's just insanity, because I always said the only plan the EU, NATO cabal had regarding Ukraine was escalation. And if the Russians stood up to them and said, okay, here's the line, and I think that line was demonstrated with the Oreshnik missile, which nobody knew Russia had, including the United States, an unstoppable delivery system. These are the guys, remember, who were fighting with shovels, stealing chips from washing machines. This was the economy that was in tatters, according to Ursula von der Leyen. Remember all that in the context of this. So I think the Oreshnik sort of demarcated enough is enough, okay? Incredible restraint has been shown by the Russians, but the Russians rely on sort of depth of the promise that they actually can and will do things. They don't do what the EU does and the United States does and the British do, 100-year promises. They signed a strategic deal with Iran yesterday here in Moscow, which is a very important thing. The Syrian outcome, I think it hurt Russia and it hurt Iran. So they've both said, well, look, we now need to sort of copper fasten our ties to push forward, to re-exert our influence again. So these are the real things that are happening. Keir Starmer can promise that, every kid's going to get a chitty chitty bang bang life-size model in 100 years' time. No one's going to be around to challenge him. But in reality, what's going to happen very soon is the EU is going to have to realize that it doesn't have the money to fund what it's given to Ukraine. Forget about funding this catastrophic war. And it's a war that Ukraine is losing. They're losing it in manpower. They're losing it militarily. Politically, the war is lost. I mean, it's not even a democracy. The idea that Europe is defending a democracy is also ludicrous. It's not a democracy. Banning the church, banning the free media, disappearing people trafficking. The list is endless. And this list was accepted and acknowledged by people like the US State Department in a year before Russian troops were forced across the border in 2022. The US State Department declared Ukraine to be the most corrupt country in Europe. It was endemically corrupt in its judiciary.
People's
financially.
memory is so short.
There's no surprises here.
That seems like a story from the last century that you're telling. Finally, Chay, and I'm grateful for your time. There will not be negotiations beginning tomorrow or next week or next month. The powwow between Trump and Putin may not even occur in the first month. But either way, the Russians are going to keep on advancing. We are looking, aren't we, at a situation where every day that goes by without a negotiated settlement means that there's less of Ukraine to negotiate about. And it's perfectly possible that we'll have what we used to call in the old days the Finlandization of Ukraine, namely that in Kiev there will be a friendly government to Russia, and all of the Russian-speaking territory, including Odessa, will actually have reverted back to Russia, in which case Western Ukraine will be a landlocked state. BlackRock and all the others can go whistle for whatever investment they think they've made in exploiting Ukrainian resources for the future. This is a thoroughgoing disaster for those who push this war, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the big topic of discussion. Russians love to talk about politics. The famous joke here is, look, I don't want to talk about politics, but, and 3 hours later, you're still talking with this guy you just met in a bar or on a bus, So everybody here wants to talk about politics. And the big issue is, Odessa. How do we link with Odessa? How do we get to our people in Transnistria, this sliver of Russian territory, essentially? There's Russian military there, Russian-speaking people there, which is borders, Western Ukraine and Moldova. So that's the big topic of discussion. In Russia, there's no doubt here at all that the war is already won. As you say, it's just a matter of time. I think personally that the EU knows that the Russians are advancing. They know, of course they know. They know everything. They know more than we do, maybe, with the surveillance they have. They know that the Russian army is advancing rapidly. But I don't think that's a problem to them, because it's less for them to have to fund the reconstruction of. And the Russians, remember, have recently taken the biggest lithium mine in Europe. They have in Pokrovsk, one of the biggest coal mines in Europe today. The Ukrainians, by the way, tried to burn the coal mine rather than leave it intact for the Russians. And of course, Pokrovsk is a Russian city, essentially. Odessa is a Russian city. Kharkov is essentially a Russian city. These are Russian cities, Russian speaking. And the tragedy of it all is, early on in the conflict, in the civil war began in 2014, which rejected this Western-installed coup government in Kiev in 2014, people were saying, look, we don't necessarily want to be part of the Russian Federation. We just want to be respected within Ukraine, in a federalized Ukraine. And to some extent, a lot of the recommendations of the Minsk Accords, which were accepted by Russia, by Ukraine, by France, Germany, Britain, and America, will end up being accepted. But it will be Russia who will have the veto on all of the elements of it, because possession is 9/10 of the law, as you know, George. And day by day, Russia has more and more territory. And the other thing is, the military complex in Russia is very powerful. The army is very powerful. There's been a lot of sacrifices made. And any delusion in the West that the Russians are clamoring to do a deal with the West is utterly delusional. I can tell you from here on the ground, there is no urgency to do the wrong deal with the West. The idea that the West can be trusted even here is remarkable. Even President Putin has said it himself. Look, I should have probably intervened earlier. We tried, we believed our partners in the West, and that's very sincere. I think there's a sense here in Russia, once bitten, twice shy. The deal that's done will not be a deal that will mean the people who are fighting today's children will fight again. And that's a very important thing that people should remember in the West.
Chay Bowes, as always, a remarkable tour de horizon. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for joining us. Are you looking forward to 4 more years of Trump? Yes or no? You can vote on Telegram, on my X, on the YouTube community poll, and on the YouTube stream. A quick break, and then your calls all the way to the hour, after which it's the legend, Sam Husseini. Stay tuned. I don't believe that the mainland European countries give a toss about Britain. And I'm certain that the United States would not sacrifice itself for Britain. That's why I say Britain is completely marginalized. As for the Trident missiles, of course, if the United States, which has dual control over these missiles, gave permission for them to be launched, of course, they would incinerate Russian cities. But what good would that do us? Because we'd all be dead, including the people that fired the missiles. You feel me?
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
40,000 likes on our TikTok stream this evening. If you are watching us on TikTok, don't forget to tap the screen in admiration, approbation. A special shout out to Tarek Jouini, who has shared the stream with over 15 friends. Top viewers tonight are DJ Misfit, Bambino, and Alicia Colas. I told you it was the province of the young. On line 1, from Brighton in England, is Damien on Trump. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George. George, I'd like to offer the best case scenario for Donald Trump's presidency, because obviously there's been a lot of negative stuff, so let's have a look at it from the other side. So if there's one thing that Trump can be certain of, and that is that whatever his legacy is, the Democrats will try to destroy it. That's, he seems to be their only focus. So that means his legacy will need to be exceptional to stop them being able to do that. Now, he's had an excellent start by demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, and he can continue building on that, building on his legacy by negotiating peace in Ukraine. But I don't believe that will be enough, George, because solving those two problems will cause him another. And that problem is America's a war economy. It depends on war. It needs it to function. So by ending the wars, it will create an economic gap for Trump, and he can fill that gap by massively investing in upgrading America's crumbling infrastructure. Trump, interestingly, has the skill set to do these things. As we know, he has the negotiation skills, and we also know that he has built very large projects. So I'm not suggesting he would manage these himself, but he would certainly have the knowledge to make sure that they were completed in an economical and timely fashion. And my last point, George, diverting money away from the military, which uses it to destroy other people's countries, and using it instead to invest in rebuilding America. I think that will also divert power away from the military-industrial complex towards American citizens. And I think if he does those things, he could be one of the best presidents in American history.
Excellent call, and definitely a best-case scenario, but not an entirely outlandish one at all. Damien in Brighton. By the way, if you are anywhere near London, at high noon tomorrow, 12 o'clock noon, me and my friends will be outside the American Embassy in London, and we will be saying bye Biden and Blinken. It will be a good riddance day. It's not a protest. You can stay away, Old Bill, Metropolitan Police. Nobody's going to drop a paper cup outside the American Embassy. It is actually going to be a joyous celebration of the regime change which occurs tomorrow and the final overthrow of the Biden-Blinken administration. Are you looking forward to 4 more years of Trump? Yes or no? You can vote on Telegram, on my X, on the YouTube community poll, or on the YouTube stream. Now, you can also leave comments if you're watching on the YouTube stream just by scanning the QR code now, as David Roth Lindbergh has. Trump did some really bad things, but still, I feel there's a much safer world with him than with the resigning administration. Hopefully 4 years more without any nuclear war. And Ben Johnson says, White House cleaning crews are getting ready to remove the over 300 tons of cocaine in the carpets in the rooms Hunter Biden was in. And Numagus 9172 says, I'm looking forward to 4 years without Biden. Naim Salam says, why on earth does the Ukraine flag fly over Downing Street? I have no idea. Paul Richmond 9720 says the USA is the same as the UK and most other countries, a one-party state with the US giving with us given the false impression that we have a choice. Let's stay in England. Asif is first up on the ceasefire in Gaza. He's in Eastham in England. Asif, what would you like to say?
Hello, George. Your glasses are looking lovely today. I was seeing a interview with the Qatar Prime Minister on Friday with Sky News, and he basically outed Biden in that he said he told the reporter that the framework of the ceasefire deal that they just signed, that Trump's man pushed, is the same deal that they presented to the United Nations on December 8th, and that was vetoed by the Biden administration.
It is exactly the same deal, as I said in my monologue, and it's a matter, therefore, of the greatest shame on all those who blocked that ceasefire, who made apologia for not having that ceasefire, who gave speeches in Parliament and parliamentary answers, who gave press conferences like the one that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes in the White House press room. It's a matter of the greatest shame on them that a ceasefire that could have been achieved, hundreds of thousands of amputated limbs, wounded and murdered people ago. Now, on Wednesday, this is important, we're launching our new MOATS.tv website. It will be fresher, faster and easier to use. You'll be able to watch the show live from there. You'll understand why that is significant and important, as well as catching up on recent monologues. Some of them, I think last Wednesday's monologue of mine is possibly the biggest one I've ever done. And clips, of course, from all the shows. You'll also be able to listen to the podcast of each show every week. But more importantly, you'll be able to donate to the show through a quick and simple donation form avoiding fees that other people purloin. You'll be able to manage your donations also. So that's coming on this Wednesday. So please, this Wednesday, check out our new MOATS.tv website. Let's go to California, where Tyrone wants to bring us up to date with the LA fires. Go ahead, Tyrone.
Hi, George. Nice to talk to you again. Yeah, I want to talk about the fires. My family history is kind of interesting. I have 4 generations in Hollywood. My great-grandfather moved out there. I'm in my 60s. He moved out there. He was one of the artists that painted the Chinese theater. And his son, my great-uncle, created the 20th Century Fox logo. He was an art director at 20th Century Fox. He did the painting at the end of the Planet of the Apes. He won an Oscar for Cleopatra. So I go way back in Hollywood. I live in the mountains outside of LA now, and I had a lot of experience with fire. We had our big fire in September where I was mandatorily evacuated, supposed to be anyway, for a week. I stayed behind and fed people's cats and that sort of thing. But the thing about these fires is you have to catch them right when they begin. The only person I've seen that had a good analysis of it is Michael Schellenberger, who's spoken to a couple people about it. And he's the one that, wrote San Francisco, he's researched the homeless things a lot and the general collapse of California. And yeah, they should have had fire trucks in the neighborhoods. They should have had helicopters over. There's a video that came out from somebody who lived near the origin of the Palisades fire. And they called 911, and there was no fire response for 45 minutes, where it went from a small fire to something. And the winds were, and they knew the winds were going to be 80 to 100 miles an hour, like hurricane force winds. So once you let a fire get going in that condition, then, there is kind of nothing you can do, especially if your reservoirs are out of water and all these other just general collapse situations, But I always thought that we should have 100 or at least 10 of these super tankers ready to go, full of water, so that whenever there's a fire, they're ready to put it out. In September, there was a big fire very close to me. I saw it start. It was called the Line Fire. It was tens of thousands of acres. And I saw it when it was a little fire. I happened to be in San Bernardino when it was 50 acres. So they could have got it then. Instead, it wound up burning all the way to Big Bear, And these are just people that don't know how to actually do anything that we have in charge, Schellenberger had an interesting term for it.
Your best people are all in the 800 American military bases strewn throughout the world where the materiel involved that could have solved every problem inside the United States is outwardly deployed to bring about death and destruction outside of the United States. But let me ask you, Tyrone, you definitely sound like a man who knows what he's talking about. I spoke to 2 good friends of mine, came for lunch today, and they're just back from California. And they made the point that it was actually cold at night in California. You see, I think a lot of people around the world imagine that these fires are happening because, California is burning up. It's so hot. But it was cold when they were there just a few weeks ago. What caused these fires? You say you saw one of them start. The suspicion must be that they are deliberately caused. Is that your suspicion?
Well, it's interesting because I've foreseen the west side of LA burning, and I thought it was because of the support for Israel that originates there. I think that there's going to be a backlash on LA because of the Zionist power base that's there. I thought it was going to be more in Beverly Hills, Santa Monica. There's guys like Haim Saban that live there. I wouldn't want to live anywhere near him. But I kind of foresaw that. But it's actually incompetence and just mismanagement. There's homeless people living in the canyons. They light fires to stay warm, like they light fires to cook, and some of them just light fires. There's, when they do these announcements that there was an announcement before the mayor left that's a super red flag warning, we call it. This the ultimate. I've never heard announcements that hysterical. They say it's going to be hurricane force winds, and we haven't had any rain at all this year. We've had half an inch of rain since October, so it's a ridiculously dry winter. I live in the mountains now. Fortunately, mercifully, the morning of the fires, we had a freak snowfall. Otherwise, I kind of have PTSD from the fire in September, There's all sorts of aspects to it, they were locked out. They bring the military in to keep you from getting to your own house. It's like there's no constitution when there's an emergency, so you have to slink around town to feed people's cats. I was behind enemy lines, which was way, too much smoke. It's, you can make a case against it, but I have feral cats to feed too. But it's intense. But and you get the feelings. There's this thing that happened in Maui. There's an element of real estate. How do we say it on the, not trickery, but it kind of sounds like trickery. There's something nasty going on.
I think we know what you mean.
To clear space, yeah. And there's that element. It was very strange, the fire we had in September, because there was no air. Usually there's tons of helicopters, and there was nothing for days, even when the fire was literally burning houses on the edge of town here. And this is in early September. But this fire is giving me PTSD. Mercifully, we had a dump of snow in the town I am. It wasn't even on the forecast the morning of the fires, but I'm still kind of freaked out by it. But these poor people in the Palisades, I know a lot of them. I'm a musician. There's record producers, all these studios. You wouldn't believe the pianos that were destroyed, the studios that were destroyed. Lou Adler's house burned down on Corbyn Beach. There's boats that could shoot, the firefighting boats, the entire line of people in Malibu. And I think that's going to have a political effect. Newsom's begging them to stay in California, okay, because they're a big tax base, and they're also these kind of passive Zionists, They're like nice people. Some of them I've worked for 40 years, and they're Jewish, and they support Israel just because they're getting something for free, and they say stuff like, well, those Arabs want to kill me, so, we should kill them first. And then they go back to, having a glass of wine and stuff, It's a sort of unenlightened.
What a fascinating vignette. I'm really grateful to you, Tyrone. You painted a picture of that part of California very vividly indeed. I appreciate it. Okay, here's the results so far of the poll. You've still got time to vote, about another 35 minutes you can vote. Are you looking forward to 4 more years of Trump? Here's the results so far. On Telegram, 48% yes. On X, 58% yes. On the YouTube community poll, 56% yes. And on the YouTube stream, 55%. That's against 52, 42, 44, 45. A much closer poll than I imagined, and a much closer poll than we normally have. Let me take a quick break, and don't forget that at exactly 8:20, the legendary Sam Husseini will be on the show. Before him, Patrick in Scotland on RFK and Trump. That'll be interesting. Stay tuned.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special announcement. A big thank you to all our wonderful listeners, as the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast is now one of the most listened to political podcasts in the entire world. We are the #1 English-speaking political podcast in the Middle East, and in the last year alone have charted in the top 10 in podcast land in Pakistan, Russia, and China. Like, rate, and subscribe to the MOATS podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts to be a part of the fastest rising independent news show in the world.
are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Are you looking forward to 4 more years of Trump? Yes or no? Get voting before the end of the show. The podcast news is again magnificent. We're on the cusp, just a hair's breadth away from the top 50 in India this week. Imagine how big that market is. We're in the top 5 in Poland. We're in the top 20 in Thailand, Malaysia, and South Africa. You can download the MOATS podcast by scanning the QR code on your screen now. And from Wednesday, you'll be able to listen to the weekly podcast on the brand new MOATS.tv website. Let's go to Patrick in Scotland on RFK and Trump. I told you, it's the Global University of the Airwaves. Go ahead, Patrick.
Hi, good evening, George. Thanks for having me on. It was just, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I'm curious and in some ways looking forward to his presidency, because he's bringing in guys like RFK Jr., who I would suggest are more kind of typically progressive-minded politicians. And I'm just hoping, and I wonder what your opinions are, if he gets approved by the Senate and so on to have a chief role in health, overlooking the FDA and bodies like this. I think it could be very positive for the American people.
I very much want to see RFK in that position. And I very much want to see Tulsi Gabbard as the intelligence director. I very much want to see Kash Patel as the head of the FBI. The rhinos, Republicans in name only, in the House and the Senate are going to have to be told by Donald Trump that their political futures depend on the confirmation of his slate of cabinet picks. Because it would be unconscionable for politicians who are entirely dependent on Trump's political coattails to be vetoing his choices. And if he doesn't get them through the cabinet, he's going to have to find a way of making sure that they are close to him around that cabinet table. And he's going to have to think creatively about that. RFK in particular, on the health issues in particular, is somebody that America vitally needs. Make America healthy again is his rubric, and with some credibility. He's been right on most of the big health issues, big pharma issues over the last 20 years. And to have him there in charge would be a very fine thing indeed. Thanks, Patrick. Prince is in Texas on Trump. Let's hear from him. Prince, welcome back. What would you like to say about tomorrow?
Hey, George. Good to see you. So a couple of things. First one is people like me, I never ever imagined that I'll be looking towards Trump for any redemption. It's funny how these neoliberal puppets all over the world, talking about people like Justin Trudeau, Macron, the clown in UK, I'm sorry to say, I know you're British, starmer. All of this, these lunatics have ruined the world, basically. They've shut out the whole idea, the whole pretentious liberal world order. Now nobody looks up to everybody just listens to them and it's a clown show. Look at how they treated your next guest. We were about to talk to him the other day. These are people talk about Trump being a fascist. Look at how they treated a journalist. The other stenographers were in the room. None of them could open their mouth and say anything because they're part of the system. And then talk about Gaza. Yeah. So we actually have a top State Department person who came up and said that, he provided evidence to the Secretary of State saying that there were war crimes, but yet none of them. So it's basically that they were supposed to be impeached for that. Why is the opposition party? Why is nobody taking them on that? So those are kind of things that make you just look at the hypocrisy and just shake your head and be like, "There's no rule of law." It's all just the same back to Berlin, 1884 Berlin Conference.
Perfectly expressed, Prince. Absolutely perfectly. I couldn't improve on it. Thanks for making that call. Simon is in London on Trump. Go ahead, Simon.
How you doing, George? Hope you're well, mate. Listen, I've got some big contradictions regarding Trump's agencies with regards to Elon Musk. Firstly, Trump claims to help American people and advocates American jobs for American people. And yet, on the other hand, you got Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They're creating new visas, which is going to send lots of Indians working on cheap labor for $9 an hour, I believe, into Silicon Valley. That's totally contradicting what Trump has done and what Trump has said, So I don't know how that's going to work. And there is another thing which nobody sees. Musk is a man who gave his full support to the Ukraine, probably like the other weapons company, even provided signed contracts to that. Now, I don't know how Trump is going to end the war in Ukraine if weapons are still being pledged to Ukraine even to this day. It's not just going to be a simple case of. I came on your show a couple of last year just to explain this as well. I just don't think this war is going to end that quickly, so simply. It's much more complicated than that. Trump will not look good if suddenly he pulled the war out and hundreds of or thousands of Americans who are in the weapons sector lose their jobs. There's going to have to be another plan for him to divert the war elsewhere, whether that be in Syria or whether that be whether that be in the Middle East somewhere. I don't know. The other thing I wanted to point out is how can a man like Trump, who's pledged, and rightly so, he's pledged that he wants to give as many, just keep drilling, as I said. So his pledge was he wants to drill for gas and oil, which is great because that's what most working class people want. But then you got Elon Musk, who's got a totally different interest, and he wants to bring in electric cars. So I don't know how this relationship is going to last, to be honest with you. I know there's issues and with regards to Trump, and Trump has been allowed back on Twitter. But the more I look at this, the closer I examine it, the more I'm thinking that Elon Musk he's going to do something. He's going to, a bit like he's turned on Farage, he could very well turn on Trump sooner than you know it, as I said. The fact that Elon Musk also last year came on the BBC and described the BBC as a reliable network and an honest source of news. Not only was it laughable, but it told me a lot about Elon Musk as a character. What do you have to? What's your opinion on that, George?
Well, I think you paint the picture of contradiction very well. I mean, Trump is a walking set of contradictions. That's why I said in my monologue it will be decided by which Trump turns up. Will it be the one from yesterday or the one from last night? Oftentimes on the same issue, in the same day, he can contradict himself. So there are other contradictions. You've pointed out some of them that may or may not bring the whole thing into troubled waters. The visa issue that you raised, we discussed it just the other night on the show. The contradiction between making America great again, American jobs for American workers, the blue collar, Steve Bannon type MAGA constituency is very different from the big tech bros around the likes of Elon Musk and others, because they're all scrambling to get alongside Donald Trump now, having allowed and in some cases themselves enunciated their absolute contempt for Donald Trump. People like Bezos, people like Zuckerberg, people like Bill Gates, they're all now trying to get alongside the colossus that is Donald Trump. My feeling is that Trump is a guy that harbors a grudge. I don't think he has forgotten the slings and arrows to which these people subjected to him. And whilst he's prepared, and rightly so, to work with anybody and not to make past political differences a barrier to coming on board, I doubt if he has truly forgiven these people. Elon Musk, as you know, I have a legal dispute with Twitter. I can't say too much about him personally, but he's got a desk now in Trump's office. That is a very, very substantial piece of real estate. That's the most important, valuable real estate that Elon Musk will ever own. And I very much doubt if he will give it up easily. But definitely food for thought, Simon. Much obliged to you. Some more comments. Peter Joliffe says, I suppose Trump is going to provide a lot of entertainment. I mean, well, he is. That is the case. Lyndon Wilson says, TikTok banned, RT banned, alternative media journalists banned and arrested, protesters arrested, ... And Paul Metz Cohen says, given Trump's record, I'm not holding too much hope. The US military-industrial complex is all-pervading. And Rahman Khalid says, America's mask taken off by Sam Husseini, who will be along in just a few minutes. Rachel Thompson says, this is all theatre. It doesn't matter who gets what office. The deep state will have its way as usual. That's a counsel of despair, Rachel. I'm loath to embrace it. Our old friend Terence in Corby wants to talk about Chay Bowes and Trump. Go ahead, Tel.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway, and glad tidings to you and your family. I think that Trump is very much a creature of habit. His die is cast long ago. He wants to see himself as a businessman, stroke art of the deal and everything else. And all things considered, BRICS is just under 30% of the world's Earth surface. So he sees that in real estate. I don't think he sees Palestine in real estate because the MIC has got him firmly by his masculine tendencies, let's say. I think he is going to be a creature of the state. There's no doubt about that. But how he will articulate his way through billions and billions of Israeli, Zionist, blood capitalist money and his desire to take all the money he can, thinking that someone was the savior of the earth, with Brazil, with India, with China, with Russia, with Iran. He'll do deals with anyone. It's a big deal going to happen. I think it'll start happening in the second year of his term because he'd have fired about 25% of what he's going to hire anyway. But I think BRICS is what he sees underneath it all. He sees real estate. And how does he walk that tightrope with the military-industrial complex? The last caller alluded to that. What say you, Mr. Galloway?
Well, again, it's a fascinating set of potential contradictions, all of which I acknowledge. I mean, if I was voting in this poll, I definitely would have voted yes. I am looking forward to 4 more years of Trump. Because the choice in the end was Trump or Kamala Harris. And I don't have any hesitation in saying I'd rather have Trump there than Kamala Harris, because I have to look in the crystal ball to see what the next 4 years of Donald Trump are going to be. But I only had to read the record to know what the next 4 years of Kamala Harris would have been. So it's a gamble, no doubt. The American people have spoken. They've decided. And we're all going to find out on the night. Now, he's here. It is Sam Husseini after this 1-minute break. Stay tuned.
You know, and it's a very, thank you for, you know, I'm a big fan of your show, Gigi. Great debate, great. And I'm Scottish. I'm very passionate about what's happening there, you know. I had a great mom. She was Scottish, Mary McLeod. She taught me well. She taught me well at everything, including golf. I love Scotland, and I love the Scottish food. It's great food. I said to Melania, you know, haggis. Look at that. What's more Scottish than that? Me. I am that haggis. She said, what, thin-skinned and full of crap?
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
I am that haggis. Sam Husseini is that journalist. I have a saying I like. I've had it on my wall for many years. It reads thus: I'm going back into the wardrobe. The men outside are all empty raincoats. I felt like that when I saw that famous, now infamous press conference at which Sam Husseini was bundled out, dragged out by thugs that looked like they could have donned brown shirts and been in Nazi Germany. He was the only journalist present, except Max Blumenthal. None of the others raised a finger, raised a single whimper of a word at what their professional colleagues were experiencing in the press room of the White House. And I'm so glad that Sam Husseini joins us now. There he is in his finest hour. Sam, that was your finest hour. It will be played forever. Of course, all the work that you'd done before that didn't get the same coverage. So the thugs actually did themselves a disfavor. They would have been better, wouldn't they, tolerating your admittedly forensic line of questioning? Why did they make that misjudgment in your view?
I'm not sure it was a misjudgment. Miller and others before him have been able to withstand my interjecting questions in a timely way. I think they made the calculation that Blinken couldn't, and that if I were to continue to blurt out timely questions undermining his narrative, that he wouldn't be able to deal with it. And so they calculated, perhaps correctly, that the visual of me getting carried out of there was less costly to them than Blinken actually having to answer questions about how they undermined the Geneva Conventions, about how they've undermined international law and the genocide case from South Africa and the orders from the ICJ with this phony ceasefire process for all these many months, how they don't want to talk about the Hannibal Directive. They calculated that visual was better for them than what the alternative was.
Irony of ironies, it's Blinken himself that is forever telling us journalism is not a crime. While at his very own final press conference, he sends in the law. Just for colour, tell us what happened. The lads dragged you unceremoniously. I heard you at one stage saying that they were hurting you. What happened next?
Well, after they carried me out of the room, then they really hurt me. They very forcefully put handcuffs on me. They dug into my pockets, pretending to search for weapons. They pushed me around to be out of the building the long way around, jostling my shoulder the whole time. I'm now taking medication so I can sleep. My arm constantly falls asleep. So the rough part was actually after what happened there, and that wasn't caught on video. No journalist thought to come out of the room and videotape what was happening to me outside.
Speaking of those imposters that act as stenographers to power, that you have to, I'm sure, with some difficulty, sit with at every one of these press conferences. Have any of them been in touch with you since? Commiseration? Regret that they didn't stand up and say or do something?
Some commiseration, no regret. From a handful, from 3 or 4 of the journalists.
And what about in officialdom? What about in the incoming administration? Are you going to be able to play the outstanding role that you've been playing, putting these jokers under fierce questioning over all of this period? Have you had your pass withdrawn? Will you be able to get back in?
They did give me all of my possessions, my computers and my phone and so on, and they did give me back my hard pass that I used to get into the State Department. I don't know if it electronically works anymore, but they did physically give it back to me, which I was somewhat pleasantly surprised at. So it's possible that I'll be able to get in with the new administration.
Do you share my view that Blinken is an even bigger war criminal than Biden, and that there's many grounds for suspecting that this was not the Biden-Blinken administration, but particularly over the last year and a half was the Blinken-Biden administration?
I think that that's a sound assessment. Blinken, both by position, his longtime relationship with Biden, his familial background, his father and grandfather were very instrumental in securing Israel's deranged position in the American political landscape. His stepfather was Pizar, who was consigliere to Maxwell, who was a Mossad agent, and then lawyer, I just found this out a few months ago, lawyer to Jeffrey Epstein. So what the hell is all of this? Who's really running things? What strings are being pulled where? He's one of the most under-scrutinized individuals who've had such an immense amount of power that I've seen.
Well, I saw more pictures of him playing his guitar than I saw scrutiny from your colleagues. It's a long way from, you know, all the president's men, Woodward and Bernstein and so on. These people that you've been sitting amongst see it as their role in life to just write down and purvey what it is they've been told by the powerful.
Yes, I mean, I would say that there's some pushback, some scrutiny, but it's at a very superficial level on a good day, and very tepid, including, I should say, not just by U.S., but most of the Arab media. You know, Saeed Erekat occasionally, you know, he is there virtually every day and will at least ask some questions with some substance behind them. But no one who would, you know, really methodically and ferociously attempt to decipher what they say, as I've attempted to do and what I imagine you would do. And I mean, a key to that, to me, is the entire thing about how they constructed this ceasefire narrative, if I can break that down for a bit.
Please.
Everybody talks about how Biden started this ceasefire process with his May 31st statement, but no one is connecting it to what happened a week before. A week before, the International Court of Justice issued the final of their orders stemming from South Africa's genocide case against Israel. And they ordered Israel, not just in general, as they had in past orders, to cease genocidal activity, but they specifically said, you are attacking Rafah, you must immediately stop your attack of Rafah, you must not invade Rafah. They spoke in very direct terms in their emergency order. Algeria then drafted, which is on the Security Council, the only Arab member of the Security Council, then drafted a resolution to implement that order, which is what should happen. The court issues the order, and the UN Security Council is supposed to act as the sheriff to implement that order. The US stalled on a possible vote to that for several days, and then Biden comes out with his phony baloney, we got a ceasefire here statement. And Algeria puts aside this resolution, and they and everybody else vote for this phony baloney U.S. resolution. The only ones who said anything substantial against it were the Russians. They picked it apart, but they didn't veto it. They abstained. Everybody else voted for it. And that's been the legal pretext by which the U.S. has attempted to hijack international law and its proper implementation so that they're in control with their backdoor shenanigans, so-called negotiations with Qatar and Egypt as their poodles. What should happen, and what should have happened months ago, is that Algeria and Turkey and Brazil and South Africa and Cuba and every other country that is calling out this genocide need to act on it and to say, you, Security Council, have failed in your responsibility. The General Assembly must now seize control of the situation and must use Uniting for Peace under 2/3 of a vote in the General Assembly. They can pass a resolution with teeth, with sanctions, with a peacekeeping force, with an arms embargo to suspend Israel from the UN General Assembly. This is what was done to South Africa because of the US veto in the 1980s with apartheid South Africa. And this was also what was done, you might recall, George, in 1956, when Israel and France and Britain invaded Gaza and Suez after Nasser invaded the Suez Canal. The US and the Soviet Union stood together against this colonial aggression and forced them back. That was the first use of a UN peacekeeping force, and Eisenhower heralded it as a great achievement in human relations. It is that kind of energy that the rest of the world must address. It is not enough for other countries to rhetorically support the Palestinians. They must put their shoulder to the wheel and use every mechanism possible, especially every legal mechanism possible, to stop Israel's onslaughts.
Now, you and I have had some disagreements in the past, though I've always loved you. One of those was about Algeria. Your feeling is that Algeria should do much more. Mine was, I think the locus or the approximate reason for it was my belief or statement that Algeria was the last Arab country standing. You've taken the view, and you partly explained it there, that Algeria could have done much more. Speak to that, please.
Yes, well, as I say, with this, it's the country on the UN Security Council. And, if you read their statements, they're better than virtually every other Arab country. I concur with that. But they're in a unique role as to be able to influence things on the UN Security Council. I mean, they could put forward, they're in the presidency right now. This month, they have the presidency. That means they determine the agenda. They could put forward a resolution every day and force the US to veto it every damn day. And I bet you if they did that you'd start to get thousands of people outside the US mission, which is across the street from the UN General Assembly. All of those students who are being shut down on their campuses at Columbia and NYU and CUNY and all of these universities could convene in front of the US mission screaming, shame, shame, shame. It's a matter of everybody strategically attempting to work together towards a true path to peace. And what that means is not just simply issuing rhetorical statements, not just simply saying the right things, but actually using the right mechanisms. When we talk about armed struggle, we would laugh if we would say somebody takes a pin out of a grenade and then throws it sideways instead of at the enemy. But that's what's happening in terms of the legal process here.
Yeah, quite so. You've got no choice because you are Arabic by ethnicity. I've got a choice, though I'm kind of almost. I'm the father of 2 Arab children and have been in the cause for so long. I sometimes